Hi, my name is Marisa Bozarth, the Museum Curator of History for Burlington County Division of Parks. And today we're going to be taking a walk through historic Mount Holly, where we're going to look at some of the historic buildings along High Street and hear some of the stories of some of the people who used to reside in some of these homes. And the first place that we're going to go to is right across the street. It is the home of Nathan Dunn. The house was built in 1832 by Nathan Dunn upon his return from China. Nathan Dunn had fallen into some debt in Philadelphia and decided that his best solution to getting out of that debt was to start a mercantile business in China. So he traveled to Canton, and while there gained the respect of the Chinese government because he would not deal in the opium trade. And he collected all sorts of things while he was there, everything from tapestries to furniture, books, really anything that would translate into showing the American people the Chinese culture. So when he returned, he brought everything with him and he settled in this house across the street, which he had built in the Chinese style. It has had some work done to it over the years, so it lost a little bit of its Chinese flair, but he did live in there, and then he opened a museum in Philadelphia for a few years where he showcased China to the rest of the world. Eventually, when he passed away, his two stepsisters inherited the property. And when they passed away, the home was sold to the Levis family in 1881. The Levises were the first ones to do any restoration to the home, where they added on the top floor that you see there. And then they eventually sold it to the Johnson family, who removed the front porch. But it does retain some of its original features. The curved windows in the front of the building are original to it. So the landscaping is original. There are two shrubs in the front lawn that are from Nathan Dunn's period that he had imported in from China. So next we're going to head up the block to another building where I'll show you a home that was created using parts of the Nathan Dunn property. So now we're here at our next stop, which is now a private residence. But the reason that we stop here is if you look at the house, there are two towers, as we call them, on either side of the building. And those towers are actually part of the stables from the Dunn property that we were just at. When the Levises were selling the property in the 1940s, they sold everything that went with the property. They were selling all of the outbuildings as well, and selling off sections of the property for lots. So what ended up happening is somebody had the idea of purchasing the stables, and they took the towers from the stable, transported them up the street, and used them as the basis for this home. So they're a very unique feature to a house in the area. You don't see anything like it anywhere else. So now we're gonna head up the street to Parent Chief's Chapels. So here we are at Parent Chief's Chapels, as it's known today. It didn't become that until 1961, when Parent Chief's actually moved from their original funeral home, which was down in what we would consider downtown Mount Holly, up to this beautiful Victorian home. The building was built in 1900, right around the mid to end, the late end of the Victorian era. So it does have a lot of Victorian features to the home, and it was built by Edward Levis. The Levises bought the Dunn property around 1881, and when they purchased it, the property extended all the way from the Dunn cottage, about 2 or 3 city blocks, all the way to what is now Levis Drive. And Edward Levis, one of the sons, had this home built on the upper end of the property. So it was built right around 1900 as a Victorian home, right around the end of the Victorian era. So it does have some Victorian features, but one of the most interesting features to the property was their garden. They had a garden known as Levis's Gardens, and it was very, very large, very extensive. It had some landscaping features that remained from the Dunn era, and some that Levis put in himself and continued it. It rivaled Longwood Gardens at the time, and people traveled from Philadelphia, New York, Camden, just to visit Levis's gardens. They had gazebos, koi ponds, walking paths, not just plants. So you could come and really experience it. It became the place for people to come take their family portraits. And some of it still remains in the back of the house. There is still a koi pond in one of the gazebos back there. A lot of it was sold off to Mount Holly Township to build the middle school. So a lot of it is where Holbein Middle School is today. But some of the features still do remain. So now we're going to head back down High Street and see a building that is very different from the Victorian era homes, and see one of the colonial homes that still remain in town. Our next stop is the Reed House, which is right behind me here, and is one of the few colonial homes still left in town. A lot of the colonial buildings were either destroyed by fire, destroyed during the Revolutionary War when the British came through, or have just been torn down, remodeled. So they don't really hold any of their colonial features anymore, but this one still does. The home was built originally by Joseph Reed. He built the original piece, which is the one on this end closest to Grant Street, around 1775. Joseph was a member of the Provincial Congress, and he also obtained the title of Sergeant at Law, which was the highest title you can receive under British law for a lawyer. He was very, very well known in his legal profession. So then his son built the other half of the house a little while later, his son Samuel. Samuel was also involved in a lot of civic duties throughout Mount Holly and Burlington County area, including being on the board of the bank. He was postmaster for a period of time. He was involved when the railroad first started to come through our area, and a lot of other civic organizations. He died in 1836, and we're not really sure whose hands the house went into when he passed away, but today it is a private business. So now we're going to move on down the street to the Prison Museum. The Prison Museum, or the prison, I should say, was built in 1811, designed by Robert Mills, who was our first nationally trained and born architect. He is from Charleston, South Carolina. You might know him better for some of his other buildings. He designed the Washington Monument, the Treasury Building, the Patent Office, and he was also involved in the U.S. Capitol construction. So I'm sure you recognize those buildings, maybe more than you recognize this one. But this was one of his very first independent designs, where he also put in his ideas on prison reform and how prisons should function in order to better our society. So he put a lot of those ideas into the design and construction of the building. The entire building is made out of granite stone that was brought in from Pennsylvania. So the whole exterior is about 30 inches of solid granite. The interior is mostly brick with some wood floors and wood steps. The original design was supposed to have a third floor with like towers on the sides, but it did not happen. But he came back and made a second design, which is exactly what you see there today. The building is one of the first, if not the first, fireproof building in the United States. It was also something that Robert Mills strived for. It was being built at a time where a lot of buildings had wood features, so if a fire broke out, it spread. It didn't always just affect that particular building, but it would spread to an entire city block sometimes. So he was trying to come up with a way to prevent that, and at least make it that the inhabitants of the building had a way to escape from the building so there wouldn't be loss of lives, which is partly why he chose the materials that he did in the construction, in using granite and brick, and there is also some marble involved with steps and headers and things like that throughout the building. And so it's a very unique building. Now sits on the National Landmark list. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1987 and is now a museum run by Burlington County. So from there, we are going to go to the courthouse, which is right next door to the prison, and we can see an example of a colonial courthouse. So we are now at the Burlington County Courthouse, or the old courthouse it is referred to. It was built in 1796. The reason it was built here was right at that time there was actually an election to figure out where to put the county seat for Burlington County. Originally the courthouse was in Burlington, and Burlington served as our county seat. A lot of residents throughout the area did not like the idea that Burlington was our county seat. They thought it was not very central to the population. So they had an election. Let the people decide where to put it. And it was between Burlington, Mount Holly, and what was then Black Horse, that is now Columbus. Mount Holly won. So the first thing that they had to do was build a courthouse. So they built this one here. The architect was a gentleman named Samuel Lewis, and it was designed after Congress Hall in Philadelphia. If you look at Congress Hall in Philadelphia and look at our courthouse, they are very, very similar. It was built in the federal style, which was the most common style of architecture at the time. Some of the features that you can notice from it is right above the door, that elliptical fan light, and also near the top of the building. They are very indicative of federal style architecture. Also the cupola up on the roof there, which houses a bell that actually rang the day that we became an independent nation. It also has very symmetrical windows. Everything lines up perfectly on the facade of the building. And also the strip that runs in between the two floors, that border is also a federal feature for federal style architecture. And the courthouse is still used today for some court cases, is the longest running courthouse in the United States at this time, and retains not just on the exterior but also on the interior a lot of its original features. So the next stop that we're going to go to is down on the corner. It is our Friends Meeting House. Here we are at the Friends Meeting House. This particular meeting house was built in 1775, just prior to the American Revolution. Originally, the Friends Meeting House for Mount Holly sat on what is now Wood Lane Road. At that time, it would have been considered way outside of town. So not only did they need a bigger building, but they also needed to get closer to the people that were trying to get to meeting on a weekly basis. So they purchased this plot of land here and built this meeting house. It was, like I said, it was built in 1775, and then the following year the revolution happened. And so it ended up actually being used as a commissary by the British and Hessian armies when they were in Mount Holly. They would go out into the surrounding community and pillage and get livestock from the local farms and bring it all back here. They could have the animals outside, butcher them, and then use them for food and provisions for the army. There's actually evidence of it inside, where one of the pews is carved out at the top. It has a big divot in it, and there are actually hatchet marks throughout where there's evidence of them actually preparing their food here. The meeting house is still in use. It is one of only about 7 throughout Burlington County that is still standing and in operation in some form. This particular one does still have monthly meetings, and weekly meetings take place from it. So now we're going to head further up High Street to a different type of church, where we're going to visit St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. Here we are at St. Andrew's Church, right across the street here. This is actually the third building that St. Andrew's had in Mount Holly. Their original building was in their cemetery, which is located on Pine Street. They started out actually as a mission of St. Mary's Church in Burlington until the mid-1700s when they realized they were growing. So they put in a petition and received a charter from King George of England in order to be their own congregation. They remained in the cemetery for a bit of time, and just like the Friends Meeting House, they outgrew the chapel that they had there. And they needed to rebuild and also get a little bit closer to town. So they built a new church, which was in what is now Millrace Village on Church Street. That is where the name of the road comes from. When they outgrew that building, they built this one in 1844, and they've been here ever since. At one period of time, right around the turn of the century, they did have a little bit of a split where they actually built a second church called Trinity Church in town, which didn't last for very long. It was only around for a few years before everybody rejoined St. Andrew's, and it's been that way ever since. It has become a staple in the Mount Holly community, offering community programs and camps, and their bells are something that everybody sort of uses in town in order to tell what time it is. It chimes every hour on the hour. So people are very, very familiar with St. Andrew's Church and their big red doors on the front of the building. So we're going to head even further up the road now to a building that doesn't quite look like what it used to look like, but it was the home of our first county chief of detectives. The gray building across the street used to be the home of our first county chief of detectives, Ellis Howard Parker. He resided there with his family up until around 1940. This is a perfect example of how a home could get changed over the course of time and lose its historical integrity. The only thing that it retains from its Victorian features is the roof line. If you look up at the roof, that and the spire on the top, those are Victorian features. The rest of the house, the way they jutted it out, stuccoed the whole front, put in new windows, you would never know there's a Victorian house hidden behind there. Now, Mount Holly is a historic district, so this was done prior to it becoming designated a historic district. So that's how that was able to take place. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to do that today in the town. And it loses its history. Nobody realizes that there's a historic home here. It's kind of hidden behind this very flat facade, new windows, stucco that's been put on, and it loses its historic integrity. And nobody realizes it was the home of one of our more prominent residents. It was the home to Ellis Parker, our county chief of detectives, for over 40 years. So we're gonna head up the street to another home that has a little bit of an intriguing story behind it and something that took place there. We are now at the corner of High and Broad Streets, where although the building itself isn't that interesting in terms of its architecture, there is a very interesting story that goes along with the building, right? Or an unsolved mystery, as we could say. A woman came into Mount Holly and rented a room for a week in this building. It was being utilized at the time as a boarding house owned by a Mrs. Nutt. The woman paid cash for her room, then went downtown and purchased a brand new wardrobe, hat, shoes, gloves, dress, everything. Went into the dressing room, changed her clothes into all the brand new clothes, and left all of her old clothes there. Paid cash for that as well. She then went to the beauty parlor and had her hair and her nails done and paid cash for that. She signed everything Mrs. J.H. Bailey. Now, when she came back to the boarding house, within 2 days she was found dead. She had committed suicide. She planned it out. She actually did it by using the gas stove, but she put putty around all the windows and the doors so nobody would ever notice that something was wrong. And eventually, Mrs. Nutt realized she hadn't seen her in a couple days and was able to get into the room and found her deceased. Next to her were 2 envelopes. One had a note for Mrs. Nutt saying, "All of the new clothes I bought can be yours for the trouble that I've caused you." She also, in another envelope, left $200 in cash to be used to pay for her funeral expenses and for anything else that was needed after her death. And signed that, Mrs. J.H. Bailey. Now, you'd think that would be the end of the story. The problem is, nobody could find a Mr. J.H. Bailey to report her dead. Nobody had reported her missing. They actually took her body to the county hospital at the time and said they were going to hold it for 2 months while they did an investigation to try and figure out who she really was, because they don't think she was giving a real name. And unfortunately, we're unable to find anyone, and it is still an unsolved mystery today. So we are now going to head up the street. We're going to go to our local temple next. Here we are at Temple Har Zion. The Jewish population in Burlington County was growing at rapid rates as early as the 1890s, which isn't something that most people probably realize. And what ended up happening is they started holding temple in their houses. They were rotating around the community to hold their services. And eventually the Depression sets in the late 1920s. And when that happened, they started using the Moose Hall as their meeting spot. They would hold their weekly services at the Moose up until around 1949 when they built this location. And they've been using it here ever since as one of the most active synagogues in Burlington County. So now we're going to head up the street just a little bit to the Waln House. Across the street from us here is the Carolyn Wall house that was built in 1880. It is a perfect example of a traditional Victorian residence. Okay, most Victorian homes from this era are going to look very similar to this one, with large front porches. They don't really feature a lot of the Greek elements that you see prior to the Victorian era. We've lost columns and things like that to the house. They're a little bit more simplified in terms of their construction, and often constructed out of brick, as you see here. So Carolyn Wall actually had this house built after her husband passed away. She was the widow of Richard Wall of Wallingford. If you've ever heard of Wallingford Village, that is that family, right, where they had an extensive flour mill. And he was also a merchant and involved in finances of Philadelphia. And then she had this house built in 1880. The reason she probably came to Mount Holly is just the Wall family for generations had connections to families from Philadelphia who had moved to the Mount Holly area as their summer homes and their homes away from the city. So she already knew some of the more prominent families of Mount Holly, such as the Reeds, the Budds, the Hazelhursts, the Ashhursts, people like that would have drawn her into town. So she was surrounded by friends and family while she was here. So that takes us to our last location, which is going to be the Langstaff Mansion, or the Lyceum of History and Natural Sciences. So here we are at our final stop at the Langstaff Mansion, also known as Langleland by the family. Langleland means the foot of a hill, which is exactly where this house is located, as right at the base of the mount that gives Mount Holly its name. At the time that it was built in 1830, it was the only house on this end of town. It was considered the edge of Mount Holly. There was nothing else in the couple blocks surrounding it. It was built by James and Harriet Langstaff when they were first married, and they raised their 4 children here. Upon Harriet's death, the house went to their youngest daughter, who lived here until about 1937, when the house was then sold to Dr. Reamer, who at the time was a physician and the county coroner. And he moved into the house until 1957, when it was sold to the Mount Holly Library. The county obtained the house around 2013. And is turning it into a history and natural science museum for Burlington County, and has done extensive restoration to the home as well. The lucky thing is with this building is that it retains almost all of its original features. Not much had been done to it over the years, and it was built at a time where there was a lot of transition in architectural styles in America. So it features 2 different styles. It has some federal elements and some Greek Revival elements. So if you look at the house there, the Greek Revival elements on the exterior are the columns on the front porch with the scroll work on the top. If you've ever seen a picture of like a Greek building, you see them everywhere. Some of the federal style elements are the symmetrical windows, even symmetrical to the door in the on the exterior of the building. And also the height of the house in the center is also something indicative of a federal style building. And one of the things I want to point out that is considered unique to this home is the belvedere on the very, very top of the home. It is excessively large for a home of this size, which just shows the wealth that the Langstaffs had at the time they were building the home. They say that James was able to go up on the top and he could actually see the Delaware River to see some of his ships coming in. He had 2 wharfs along the Rancocas Creek in town, so he would be able to watch his ships come into the Rancocas and be able to figure out when they were going to arrive so he could meet them downtown, which is kind of very interesting. The interior of the house features original architecture as well, with ceiling medallions, fireplaces, hardwood floors, and things of that nature. So we welcome you to come back. It is open to the public now, so come in and see some of those features. It's a gorgeous home, inside and out, so we hope you'll come visit and check it out. So I hope you enjoyed our tour of Mount Holly, just High Street. There's so much to see in town, so we just focused on some of the highlights. So we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you'll come back and wander around town and experience it for yourself sometime. Take care.